With that, ladies and gentlemen, we will be moving to our next session, which is a spotlight session on upgrading your self-ware. And for this session, we are extremely happy to have Mr. Sudhanshu Palsule, award-winning educator, CEO advisor, and leadership coach in the field of transformative leadership. Professor Palsule is regarded as one of the leading thinkers in the fields of complexity and transformative leadership. He is a senior associate at the Moller Institute, University of Cambridge, and he also teaches at Duke Corporate Education. His globally run leadership workshops are renowned for their transformative impact. He has taught at several leading universities and business schools over the past 3 decades, including INSEAD and Helsinki School of Economics. His current research and work focuses on building effective 21st century organizations and teams that can thrive in increasingly complex global ecosystems. His new book, Rehumanizing Leadership: Putting Purpose Back into Business, will be published by the end of this year. His last book was The Social Leader: Redefining Leadership for the Complex Social Age. Ladies and gentlemen, with a huge round of applause, please help me welcome Professor Sudhanshu Palsule on the stage, please.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is, it's not easy following someone like Vandana after she's come and spoken about her extraordinary experiences. I'm also conscious that I'm going to be standing between you and dinner, so being at the end of a long day has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage apparently is that if you don't attend my session, you don't get the goodies afterwards, right? That's the advantage. The disadvantage is that you're probably tired and you want to get back home or wherever you want to get to. So I'm hoping that I can arouse your interest and keep your passion for the next 45 minutes or so. All right? So what I'll try and do is speak as interactively as possible. I'll try and communicate the message in a way that keeps your attention, and I'm hoping that you can participate as much as anything else. So let me start with this whole area that I started calling self-ware a long time ago, and I'm going to introduce the whole area to you with a couple of slides. Take a look at that picture out there, and you'll see that there's something wrong with the bridge. It's not photoshopped. It's a real photograph of a bridge that is leading up to the river. It should have been leading over the river. So if you can imagine what this picture is meant to represent, it really talks about a complex, uncertain, ambiguous world in which we exist. Because when that bridge was built, we didn't reckon that there would be a storm in the year 1995 called Hurricane Mitch, and the river would change its course. And I love this picture because to me it represents the kind of time we are living in right now. And as you can see by the quote I'm using from Harari out there, the 21st century is going to be largely about irrelevance. It's about how we can continue to try and stay relevant in an accelerating 21st century. Over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try and take you very quickly through what I think are the reasons why the time that we are living in right now is arguably one of the most dramatic times that we have ever seen in human history. If you take a look at human history itself, the 2 most dramatic times that have taken place are the agricultural revolution that took place a long time ago, as a result of which we learned to settle down in one place and we created human societies. And the second time that this happened was the industrial age with the technology revolution. These are the 2 big changes that have happened. What I'm suggesting is that we are in the middle of something extraordinary right now. Take a look at this calendar that I put together for my last book in 2014. And if you look, a lot of the changes out there that have happened, the big changes, have all been with the spread of knowledge, especially the year 1440. I don't know how many of you remember the term or the name Gutenberg. Gutenberg invented the printing press. And until the printing press came, only the very, very wealthy people had books in their homes. Books were more expensive than gold and diamonds. Having a book was a sign of a social status. And as a result of that, the democratization of information was pretty limited. So if you take a look at Christianity, for example, there used to be 2 copies of the Bible, both locked up in the Vatican, right? Well, what happened with the printing press in 1440 was that suddenly information became democratized. It led to the spread of a whole bunch of things, and socially, there was a huge amount of reform as a result of that. My contention is that the year 1995 was a very similar year. It was the beginning of a big wave that began where the internet got commercialized for the first time. And some of you might remember, the older people in the room might remember the first email addresses that you had around that time. We had companies like Alta Vista, CompuServe, and some of those things. They don't exist anymore. We had to wait until the year 2007 before literally all hell broke loose. What happened in the year 2007 was that computing power reached an inflection point. Computers literally became faster than they had ever been before, but they broke a barrier in terms of their computing speeds. Storage capacity reached an inflection point. And lastly, the ability of computers to talk to each other and connect up with each other reached an inflection point. And we suddenly had in the world at that time a proliferation of information source. So every single social media that you can think of today, which is LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you talk about, they all come from 2007. That was the beginning of a massive revolution. Now, what's that whole social age is all about? Well, it's about these 4 things: unprecedented global networks and information flows. We are suddenly starting to look at what we now call, the exponential impact of digitalization. We don't really understand what exponential is. It takes time. The human brain prefers linearity a lot more than being exponential. Thirdly, socially created information. This is a big change in human society, where for the first time, we now have more information created in the social space than in the institutional space. And this is it's a fundamental game changer. So for example, some of you older people will remember the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? Every time we used to go to the library in the colleges, we used to read that. It was the last word in well-documented, peer-reviewed, well-researched information. It doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't exist not because it was not good, but because it became irrelevant. It was no longer relevant in an accelerating 21st century where information was produced at a rate that we had never imagined. For example, I don't know how many of you know this, but more information has been produced in the last 19 years of this century than ever before in recorded human history. Close to 100% of all information available in the world today was put together in this century. And you say, how can it be close to 100%? It's because the curve is completely exponential. And lastly, we are seeing the rise of very serious, complex global problems. And this is where we are right now, and therefore I want to take you very quickly through what I call the 4 tipping points. We are starting to stare at something hugely powerful. And the human brain, my argument today is that the human brain will have to evolve dramatically if it has to make sense of all this, and if we are to thrive and win in this VUCA world that we are talking about. The first tipping point is this one: the massive yawning gap between technology acceleration and human cognitive processing, the ability of the brain to process information. The human brain has fundamentally not changed for 70,000 years. That was the last time your brain got an upgrade. 70,000 years ago, when we developed the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the brain, which does all the thinking and reasoning, which is responsible for all those wonderful things that we do. But that was the last upgrade. Nothing has changed since then. But technology is on an exponential curve. And my feeling is that we are somewhere here right now. And we haven't seen anything yet. We literally haven't seen anything yet. So the gentleman earlier was talking about AI. We're just beginning to see the first nascent baby steps of AI. It's going to get huge in the next few years. The next 10 years are going to be dramatic. For example, just 4 months ago, AI was able to beat the best poker players in the world. I wonder if any of you picked up that story. Now, this is a big story because you can understand AI beating chess players. That's understandable. You know why? Because chess is an easily codable process. You can code AI into playing chess. These are regular steps that you can take, right? But how do you code AI into learning how to play poker? Because in poker, you got to bluff. You got to lie. That's why we have the term poker face, right? How do you teach AI how to lie? You cannot. The beauty of this is that AI learned to bluff after a few steps. It very quickly picked it up from the other players. And once it learned how to bluff, it could do it with audacity because without having emotions, it's able to bluff very easily. We got to think about what it means if that gap between acceleration and the way we process information internally keeps getting bigger and bigger. This is going to have a huge impact on the human race. Number two, obsolescence of familiar organizational structures. You see, ever since we've had organizations on this planet, we've had hierarchies. The hierarchy has been a traditional organizational form ever since we've known it. And we know how to operate inside a hierarchy. We've created extensive structures of hierarchies in our organizations, in our societies, in our governance. All that is hierarchical. Now, what happens when the hierarchical structure itself starts becoming obsolete? We don't have an alternative to that yet. And yet, if you take a look at what technology is doing, it is networking us at a pace that we cannot even imagine. You see, the human brain doesn't understand the power of the networks that we have. You are literally billions of people connected in powerful networks all around the world, but the brain doesn't get it. And so what happens when these familiar structures become obsolete? Number three, this is something I like to talk about these days. The past is becoming more and more irrelevant when it comes to technology and change. You see, up until now, even technology used to be cumulative. So you have a faster steam engine, you have a faster car, you have a better plane, you have something becoming better. We are suddenly now staring at a massive quantum jump in the way technology operates. So the past, in a sense, is going to start becoming irrelevant, which means expertise that has been built up by all of us over a number of years is suddenly going to start becoming pretty much irrelevant. It really won't matter how much we know. And this is going to be a pretty difficult step for human beings to take. And lastly, our life support systems on the planet are pretty much overshot. I just attended a conference the other day in Cambridge. Sir David Attenborough was present for that one. And we were told how we are right now on the cusp of a 2-degree increase of global temperatures all around the world. And we are just about managing it. 2 degrees is all about that we can manage. If that temperature rise goes up beyond 2 degrees, we're going to see some dramatic effects happening, which is going to affect the world of business, the world of technology, every single thing. Some of you might remember about 5 years ago, the United Nations put a number out saying that cities like Mumbai are going to be seriously affected by the year 2080. It might even be submerged by the year 2080. But guess what happened last month? The UN brought down that number from 2080 to 2050. Mumbai might be submerged by the year 2050. How do you explain this dramatic shift from 2080 to 2050 in literally less than a year? That's the exponential that we are looking at. So therefore, the question that I want to ask all of us is, how do we plan to stay relevant in this accelerating 21st century? How do we learn to think differently? How do we learn to actually use our brains a little more differently than we have been doing until now? That's the big question I'd like to ask this evening. And for me, the real problem is that we have learned to think and solve problems in a certain way until now. You see, I was qualified as a physicist a long time ago, all right? So in the early part of the 80s, I was teaching physics. And I remember that every time in physics we had a nonlinear equation, a complex equation, right? Any kind of nonlinear complex equation, we would routinely linearize it. We loved straight lines. Economists loved straight lines in the previous century. Straight lines give you the illusion of control and predictability, right? If you have a straight line, if I give you two variables, you can easily predict what's going to happen 5 years from now. That's why economists loved straight lines. It kind of gave us a handle on what's going to happen in the next 5 years. You can make predictions based on that. And even we as scientists did the same thing. We would linearize equations. And the reason why we did that was because it was easier to manage. We are suddenly now finding ourselves in a time in the 21st century where linearity is going out through the window. That's why we call it the VUCA world. We are dealing with exponentials. Let me give you one example of exponentials, just to tease you a little bit. For example, if I walk 30 linear steps, like 30 linear steps, if I walk right across, I'm likely to walk approximately 30 meters, right? If one step can be, long step is about a meter, I walk 30 meters. If I take 30 exponential steps, I can walk so far that I can travel around the planet 25 times. You see, the human brain does not understand exponentials. Because all until now in human history, we've been dealing with linearity, we've been dealing with straight lines. We are suddenly at a time in our history where technology acceleration and the way we are connected with each other is producing exponential effects. Take a look at the conflicts happening in the world. Take a look at Hong Kong. What is happening there right now and what's been going on. The spread of that kind of revolution is all coming out of the ability of young people to be able to connect to each other in ways that they've never been connected before. We are looking at dramatic exponentials. At the same time, is complexity new? Not at all. We are surrounded by complex systems. Nature is enormously complex. In fact, that's why nature has been around for such a long time. That leaf that you see there is part of an enormously complex system. That leaf doesn't end at its edges, it begins at its edges. It begins its relationship with the sun at the edge. That's what the ecosystem is all about. But we have never really understood it. Some of you older people might remember when Chernobyl happened in the year 1989 or 1986. You know, we were surprised, some people were surprised when they found fish off the coast of Japan with toxic poisoning in them. And the question was asked, how did it get there? How did the pollution travel so quickly through the ecosystem that fish being caught off the coast of Japan had radioactive materials in them? Well, that's when we began to understand what an ecosystem really looks like. So we don't have much of a good track record in understanding complexity. We've got to really learn how to do it. We've got to train ourselves. Our children are better. The millennials are a lot better about in dealing with complexity. For example, all of us sitting over here, or many of us, the younger people are not, but anyone who is old enough to remember the last century will remember that we are immigrants to this century. We are not natives, we are immigrants. So the kind of wiring in our brain that we bring to the way we solve problems, we learn, is coming from the previous century. And what I mean by the previous century is we are trained in industrial age thinking. And we've got to figure out a way of changing that. I'm just very quickly going to take you through why I think the brain, your self-ware, requires an upgrade. Number one, I call it the trap of biology. A lot of the way we think is still based on survival, right? Our brains were sculpted in the African savanna. That's where a lot of the wiring that we carry in our brains was created. It was created for survival. And that's the reason why the human species lasted for so long, has lasted for so long, and how we rose to the top of the food chain, right? Now that is great if we are in real physical danger. But that apparatus that we carry in our brains is absolutely useless when we are dealing with the VUCA world, right? So that's the trap of biology. Number two, the trap of fragmentation. We, during the industrial age and post-industrial age, we learned to break things down into small, tiny parts and understand each part. In fact, science was, classical science was a result of that. The problem with that is we forgot to appreciate the whole. We lost touch with the whole. So for example, if you were a botany student in your college or school, you would study what a flower was by taking the flower from the plant, bringing it into the laboratory, putting it under an electron microscope and studying it. And it's a good thing. I'm not criticizing it. But that gave you limited information on the flower because you broke it down into its parts. What you didn't do was understand how the flower was connected to the rest of the ecosystem. You see the kind of example I'm bringing up, right? This perspective is only one perspective. We've also got to understand the whole. And the 21st century is challenging us to understand the whole because suddenly we are thrust into ecosystems. Your organization today is as good as your relevance to the ecosystem. If you're not relevant in the ecosystem, you're out. It doesn't matter how good you've been. It doesn't matter how successful you are. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter that for the last 25 years you've been doing well in your organization. If you're not relevant to the ecosystem, you're out. This is the big challenge for a lot of the clients I'm working with right now, both in India and abroad. How do we suddenly start thinking differently where we don't think of competence and all those things that we've been talking about so far, but we start talking about relevance? I often challenge a lot of young people in the same way. If you're around 40 years of age, how do you plan to stay relevant for the next 25, 30, 40 years? I challenge you into saying, you're going to be working till you're 75. Okay? So if you're 40 years old right now, you got about 35 years left of being relevant. What are you going to be doing about it? How do you stay relevant? How do we keep this apparatus that we carry in our heads relevant in this accelerating world? And one of them is this trap of fragmentation. The trap of efficiency. Efficiency is good, but it prevents a whole bunch of other things. Our mindsets in our offices and factories and our organizations are still governed by what we learned in places like the Ford Motor Plant 100 years ago, right? Now, there's an advantage to producing cars as fast as possible, but that's not the only mindset we require. The trap of efficiency is such that it prevents us from doing something else, which is being innovative, being agile, and being adaptable. The two mindsets are entirely contrary to each other. And so we've got to figure out how we can, instead of falling into the trap of efficiency, also do things that do not require efficiency. And lastly, this is something that is so critical, the trap of domination. We have just got used to a world in which power is driven from above. If I ask you to close your eyes and think about power, you'll invariably think of power as being a top-down activity. That's the way we experience it. And yet we are being challenged in this by the new millennial generation, for example, who have a very different idea of power. You see, the way we understand power comes from hierarchical structures that were designed to give power as you got higher and higher. But when those structures start disappearing and those layers become less and less, what is your alternative for power? What new power do you use in an accelerating 21st century where there are no hierarchies? And we haven't figured that out yet, and we'll have to meet that challenge as quickly as possible. So therefore, we truly need to unlearn something very quickly. We have to learn, but we have to unlearn, and that's really the message I'm trying to create over here. If we don't do that, we run the risk of becoming obsolete. We need an upgrade. All right? So here's my proposition. The last upgrade that the human brain got, that your brain got, my brain got, was 70,000 years ago. That was truly the time that the front of the brain formed itself. That's why human beings have the largest frontal brains in any species on the planet, right? I don't know when the next biological upgrade is going to happen. I have no idea, right? It may take another 1,000,000 years. But what I do know is that as individuals, you and I will have to find ways of upgrading our own self-ware. So I kind of brought up this term playfully one day, many years ago, about 20 years ago, when I was teaching a class. And I think I was teaching a class of computer people. They were software engineers and hardware engineers. And we were talking about the human self. We were talking about all the great things about what it meant to be a human being, and we talked about things like purpose and values and all those things. And during lunchtime, one of them came up to me and said, "You mean it's something like some software that drives us? Is that what you're talking about?" And I said, "Yeah, probably it is." And that's the time we came up with the term self-ware. All of us carry this program inside ourselves called self-ware. It doesn't exist in reality, I'm just making up the name. That self-ware is a program that drives us. It drives us to function in a particular way. And that self-ware is responsible for the way we perceive, the way we interpret, and the way we respond. It's almost like that core of who we are. All right? Now, what goes into that perception, interpretation, response is millions of years. For example, I talked to you about how the brains were sculpted on the African savanna, which means when you look at me, for example, when I walked onto the stage right at the beginning, when you looked at me, your perception of me was deeply emotional. It was not rational. I don't know how many of you are interested in neurology, but the one thing I can guarantee you is when you take in new stimulus with your eyes, the information does not go to your rational brain first. It first goes to your emotional brain. I don't know how many of you know this. And the reason it goes to your emotional brain is because your emotional brain is faster, it's more volatile, but it can keep you alive. So for example, if I represent a threat to you, you can easily take a decision to walk out of the room right away. That's why information reaches the emotional brain first. Now that was great as long as we were operating in a wild and inhospitable terrain where you were likely to meet wild animals. Because when you meet a wild animal, the last thing you want to do is think. You don't want to think. So you want to hand control back to something that is faster, that can keep you alive. And that's your emotional brain. So that emotional brain can take a decision whether to run or fight. That's why we call it fight or flight. Now the problem is that response, that emotional response is still there in your brains, even now. So even today, when you take in stimulus through your eyes, it first goes to the emotional part of the brain, not the rational part of the brain. So when I walked onto the stage, if you say, "Oh, this guy looks like a weird guy, let me just get out of here." Right? So you haven't given me a chance, you haven't listened to me, but you've taken a decision based on what your emotions are telling you. That's what I'm talking about. That's perception. That's how we perceive, interpret, and respond. So my point is, in a 21st century context, how do we transform that? How do we change that? How do we understand the complexity of the world that we are in right now, and we learn to perceive differently, interpret differently, and respond differently? How do we get more agile? How do we become more adaptable in the way we work? These are questions that I'm asking right now, and we've got a few ways of figuring that one out because that's the way it works. So I've got a very simple model to offer you, some simple tools to offer you, which I'll do right now. Most of us spend a lot of our time thinking in what I'm calling them the mindsets. Most of us spend our lifetime thinking in two mindsets. The first one is an automatic mindset. We are largely unconscious in the way we process information. Largely unconscious. We think we are conscious, but we are largely unconscious. So the brain is operating automatically using biology, bias, and belief, and that's the way it's working. And that's part of your survival brain. It's the same brain that kept us alive in Africa at one time. It's the same brain we are using even today. Every time you operate from a bias or from a belief, you're using that same automatic system. Nothing has changed. There's one more mindset we use very often. I call it the reactive, and that's a slightly different one. So for example, when we bring in lots of information into a meeting and we have a conversation in our meetings, we are doing what is called reactive thinking, and that's really about maintenance. So most of us spend a lot of our time operating between survival and maintenance. And my contention is that we are suboptimized. Unfortunately, our education has trained us to operate in these two levels. The way we live in our societies is very often training us to operate in these two levels. There is another mindset out there which I call the mindful mindset. And that's really where all the learning takes place. And every now and then we do visit that place, but we come right back to the first and second. My question is, how do we learn to spend more time in the mindful mindset? And what is that mindful mindset all about? What does it mean to be more mindful? What does it mean to be more aware? Now, I'm conscious that I'm talking in a country where the first seeds of mindfulness were sown thousands of years ago. And yet, it's ironic that it's the same, it's in this place when I come, there's hardly any mindfulness around in the way we run our societies, our organizations, our televisions, our politics, our governments. There's no mindfulness. It's completely at the level, right now, if I look at, I hope I'm not going to offend anyone when I talk about the situation in most governments in the world right now, including India, it's all happening over here. There's simply no conversation. There's simply no intelligent conversation happening. It's all operating at this level. The question is, how many of our organizations are operating at that level? And now we talk about VUCA and complexity and AI and 21st century. Do we have the software internally to really understand that, to be able to win in a VUCA world? I don't think so. We seriously need to work on ourselves. And this is going to be a matter of choice, because we cannot wait for nature to give us the next upgrade of dealing with a VUCA world. We have to make the choice. And to me, that's what leadership is all about. How do I change the way I operate, and how do I take my people with me in that journey towards getting more intelligent? So our biggest challenge as individuals and as leaders is going to be this one. It's going to be a threat to our old identity. It's the identity that was given to us for all these years, because we've been successful with our old identity. You know, the prism of the old identity is about status, authority, and power, and I'm saying none of those is going to matter in the 21st century. It's out. What is going to matter is how relevant you are. Your status does not make you relevant. Authority will not make it relevant. There's a big difference between authority and leadership. We confuse the two very often. Just because somebody has a fancy job title, we automatically assume that that person is a leader. That's the worst of all assumptions. Leadership is a process. It's a process that anybody ought to be able to walk into when it's necessary. The question is, how do we prepare people around us at any level in an organization to step into that place of leadership? That's when the magic starts happening, not when just a few people at the top are leaders. Doesn't work. How do we enable leadership to happen at all levels? And lastly, how do we understand that the way we use power has got to substantially change? You see, all through the last century, the emphasis was on giving people entitlements, because there was a long ladder we could climb. The hierarchy was big. And so you could go from here to here, here to here. We could give you bigger cars, bigger offices, bigger job titles. You know, all these things serve the purpose of the hierarchy. What happens when the hierarchy comes to an end? How do we establish power? Let me just share one quick piece of research with you. We found recently, about a few years ago, some of my colleagues who are neuroscientists, we found that there is a big difference between actually having power as a resource and feeling powerful. We all know that power is required, power is necessary, right? You need power to take decisions. You need power to implement something. You require power to make change happen in society and in your organization. But there's a difference between having power as a resource and feeling powerful. Feeling powerful is the ego. It's self-importance. Now, here's what we found out. When people fall into the trap of feeling powerful, big changes take place in their brains. And one of the biggest impact that happens in your brain is your empathetic system shuts down completely. People who feel powerful, you know what it means to feel powerful? Do you know who I am? That's feeling powerful. When people get into that place, your empathetic system shuts down completely. And in the last session, we talked a lot about empathy, if you remember. That's what Vandana was talking about. So in the 21st century, my feeling is that we'll have to start separating power from feeling powerful. There's no room for feeling powerful, but there's a lot of room for power. As I bring this to a close, I want to take us back to where I began. So therefore, what are some of the tools? What do we need to do differently? And I'm going to go back to an old Buddhist piece of philosophy where they call the beginner's mind. And it's a beautiful quote that says, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, in the expert's mind there are few. So what does it mean to cultivate a beginner's mind? A mind that is pliable, that is agile, that is adaptable, that's almost innocent, that's able to look at the world with fresh eyes, with new eyes. How do we actually inculcate that, develop that in ourselves? Because this, to me, is the biggest step that we can take if we are to upgrade our self-ware. We learn to perceive differently. You know, being technical experts is one thing, and I'm glad we are. But what that comes in the way of is the beginner's mind. One of the things I keep telling people who are working in technical jobs, in technology, functional experts, finance people, I keep asking them one question: do you read poetry? Do you read literature? Are you moved by poetry? Do you spend time with that? If you don't, you're reducing the capacity of your brain to think clearly. We've got to have multiple sources coming into our brains to upgrade ourselves. You know, I think Vandana talked about it in the last session when I was sitting down there listening to her. She talked about people with engineering degrees who just do this for 2 years and quit. And I think in our country, in India over here, we really have to sort this out. This whole bias towards engineering, medicine, accounting, dentistry, finance, and now, of course, computing and so on. The world is so much more than that. And even if those of you who are in those trades find love in other things too, because as a neurologist I can tell you, as a psychologist I can tell you, that when you are a good technical person and you read poetry, your brain has much more neural activity going on that allows you to think better. You're able to deal far better with complex information. But being purely a technical expert doesn't get you there. And one of the things we'll have to start talking about very soon in this country, and I'm sure you already are, is how do we completely revamp our education system? How do we help children at that age to recreate the joy of learning, but not learning by rote and not learning all the technical stuff so that you come out with those, 99.2% because you need, no, none of that nonsense. And yet, here's the country where we have had extraordinary traditions. We have tradition of the Shantiniketan, not far from here. We have the J. Krishnamurtis from this part of the world. We've had some of the greatest thinkers come. Where's all that? What we have is a rabid nonsense, which is reactive, biological, wasteful. Our television channels are full of screaming TV anchors who are overpaid to spew nonsense. I really am concerned. Where is the intelligent conversation happening at that mindset 3? That is the job of leadership. And if no one else is doing this, I think we as corporate leaders will have to take the bull by the horns and we'll have to lead this place. I think it took Mr. Rahul Bajaj the other day to speak up for the first time. Now, this is not about politics, but this is about intelligent conversations. That's what we require. And in a way, the beginner's mind is a bit like that. It's about going back to a place where we can have those conversations. Finally, how do you build your beginner's mind? And as a psychologist, I'll give you some tools. I call them mind tools. And the first one is generosity. The first tool is generosity. Generosity produces extraordinary changes in the human brain. Extraordinary changes. Now you might ask me, I'm a corporate person, I work in an organization, how can I be generous? Well, it's simple. Be generous with your attention. You know, attention, your human attention is going to become the most important resource of this century. And it's under onslaught right now, by the way. Those phones that we carry in our pockets, which many of you are using right now for a good purpose of taking pictures, Those phones are wonderful. They keep you connected to the world 24/7. You're networking like crazy. But those phones are a serious source of diminishing attention. We call it cognitive depletion in psychology. If we don't watch out, we are really under serious threat. So here's the problem, right? On the one hand, this century is going to require attention more than anything else, and on the other hand, our technology is depleting our attention. We got to work on that. But as a leader, when you give the generosity of attention, when you listen, when you pay attention to someone, when you pay attention to something, that is the biggest gift that we bring. And incidentally, when you do that, you produce extraordinary changes in the biology and chemistry of the brain. You suddenly open up new neural networks, and you begin to think better. Generosity is good for thinking. Think about that. And then there are a few more tools that are not very surprising. Empathy is fast emerging as the biggest gift that we carry with us. When I wrote the book, Rehumanizing Leadership, which is coming out, actually it came out last week, I spent a long time interviewing a lot of neurologists all over the world. I said, tell me something that AI cannot replicate. And they came with, they said two things basically. One is empathy, and the other one is purpose. These are fundamental human attributes: sense of purpose and the ability to empathize with another. The ability to empathize is much more than just feeling sorry for someone. The ability to empathize is about a deep understanding of what's going on around us and being able to be very mindful about it. That's true empathy. Empathy is a muscle. We can develop it. We are all born with the latent potential for empathy, but very few of us actually develop it. And incidentally, talking about gender, women develop empathy a lot earlier and faster than men do. A young woman of 19 has got a fully developed empathetic function in her brain. A young man of 90 is usually an idiot, right? No offense, man, I'm just a joke. Men take a long time to develop empathy. Very often it happens only when you're in your early 30s. And some men, as we know, never develop it at all, right? It's a muscle. It can be trained. We have to find ways of exercising it. And we have to make time for it. Curiosity is the one that we have to pay a lot of attention to. As children, we were all curious. It's a natural state. But as we grow up, one, it gets squashed out of our systems. Our education guarantees that we lose our curiosity. That's one thing. But the second thing that happens is also biological. You see, the human brain consumes about 28% of the entire body's energy. 28%. This little 8-ounce thing sitting between your ears consumes 28% of the body's energy. It's disproportionate. It's a huge amount. So therefore, one of the KPIs that nature has put on the human brain is to try and conserve the energy. How does the brain conserve energy? By going on autopilot, by developing biases, by having default systems. And unfortunately, those come in the way of curiosity. So as we get older, we become less and less curious because the brain's doing other things that is keeping it busy, like attending meetings, thinking strategically, and all those wonderful things you do as corporate leaders. But you know something? It's all coming back. The 21st century is going to be about staying curious. We have to find ways of making sense of what's happening in the world around us. We have to pick up weak signals before they turn too loud because it's going to be too late. When technology accelerates so quickly, when things change very quickly, what you want from your people in your organizations is the ability to pick up those weak signals quickly. And if you really want them to do that, they've got to be curious. Every single organization I walk into, they all want to be agile today. That's the new buzzword. Agile. If you want to be agile, you've got to be curious. You cannot be agile, but agility is not a process. It's not a software. And that's why we need to pay attention to that. This has been around with us since the dawn of civilization, and it will continue to be. Humility is great for the brain. Arrogance is awful. When we get arrogant, we shut down thinking in the prefrontal cortex. Higher levels of thinking are not possible. We operate at the basic level. Arrogant people operate very much at the base level, mindset 1 and 2 mainly. Arrogant people do not climb up to mindset 3. Arrogance is deadly. Arrogance in organizations is horrible. It's called hubris, beautiful word. And you know what happens when organizations become arrogant. You don't have to think too far. Think of Nokia, one of the greatest organizations in the world in the year 2004, doesn't exist anymore in the way it used to exist. And one reason for that was arrogance. Arrogance doesn't mean you're cruel or anything like that. Arrogance means you basically stop seeing what is happening around you. And lastly, openness. For God's sake, we need more openness in the world. We need conversations with each other. We need to heal the divide. I don't know what's happening in the world. It's just going crazy at the political level. We seem to be, here's the paradox. While technology is bringing humankind together and allowing us to create these wonderful networks right across the world, we are dividing ourselves by the day. Communities against communities, caste against caste, nations against nations, groups against groups. It's almost as if we are regressing in the world today as technology increases, as advances. I have a simple explanation for that. Whether you agree with me or not, I don't know. But in times of great change, it's almost like the eclipse when suddenly it starts going dark. But that darkest hour is usually before the light comes back again. How long it stays dark, I don't know. But currently, it certainly seems to be that happening, where at the level of governance in the world, we are almost like putting up a last gasp of defiance against a world that is changing dramatically. So on the one hand, technology advances. On the other hand, the human mind regresses. Our societies are regressing. I'm sorry to say this. I'm 61 years old. My hair sometimes makes people think I'm a lot younger. I'm not. I'm 61 years old. I've been around on this planet for a long time. I grew up in this country. And when I come back today, on the one hand, I'm amazed at the change and the attitudes, the energy. It's all wonderful. But I'm also deeply worried at what I see. And I'm hoping that our organizations, our business organizations, start displaying a lot more leadership in taking not just their organizations into the 21st century, but our society as a whole. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay. Thank you. I know it's late, and I'm not going to keep you. I don't want to stand between you and whatever is happening outside. But if there are any burning questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Sir, yes, could you hand the gentleman a mic, please? Thank you very much.
Sir, good evening.
Hello.
So you spoke about 70,000 years ago, the human brain received an upgrade. So do you really think that we need an upgrade now? Because we hear a lot about, this midbrain activation, opening of the third eye of children, basically below 15 years. So how true is that? Like they say that only 5% of our brain is being utilized at any given point of time.
I know, it's a great question, and I really don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. And I've spent a long time, and I'm based at Cambridge, so I do get access to a lot of good thinkers in this area, but no one really knows. And the reason is it's all happening in real time. The fact of the matter is that the world is dramatically different today than it was when our brains got formed. So if you were a designer and you're creating a product, right, you would say, yes, the product is created for a certain time, but at some point you got to bring an upgrade in because it's not going to function effectively. So from that point of view, yes, we are ripe for an upgrade. I don't know what nature has in mind. For now, my more important concern is whether we are going to survive as a species. I think, or maybe the upgrade is part of the survival. I don't know, truly. It's a fabulous question. It's something that will keep us talking about for a long time, but I really don't know, So the only thing I can talk about is whether you and I can do it in our lives. You see, I'm a firm believer in one thing, that when we are born with whatever nature gives us. But so in a way, we are not fully formed as human beings. It's the purpose of a lifetime to become fully human. We humanize ourselves. And to humanize ourselves in a lifetime means we start becoming better than what we are meant to be. We overcome many of the biological things that we carry in us, right? So for example, one of the biggest biological impulses that the human being has is the need for revenge. Do you know that? The need for revenge is a very powerful driver in human beings. But that's at the biological level, and nature has put it there for your survival. As we live our lives, we have to learn to overcome that, because that's what it means to become a human being at the end. That's why the book that I've written right now, I called it Rehumanizing Leadership. And interestingly, sir, you know what happened? When I began writing this book with my colleague, I think 2 years ago, we came up with the title Rehumanizing, and I typed Rehumanizing into Google. It immediately auto-corrected it to Dehumanizing. Because that's more rampant than rehumanizing. The word dehumanizing is there in Google, in every single search engine, but not rehumanizing. So thank you for asking the question. Thank you. Yes, sir. Could you pass the mic to this gentleman here, please? Thank you.
So my question is, we use the word revenge right now, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but can revenge be cultural, or can it be in a particular society?
It's a very powerful question. So I would, as a scientist, I'll answer it in the best way I can. We all carry in our brains the possibility for doing the most amazing things with our lives and our societies. The capacity for healing is in our brains, the capacity for love, the capacity for kindness, the capacity for compassion, the capacity for extraordinary powerful emotions. And yet we also carry the same capacity for revenge in our brains. It's there. It's part of the self-ware. We have it. How we are brought up activates one or the other. You know, a long time ago, when I worked for the United Nations, I spent 6 months in the Gaza Strip in Palestine. Those were tough years. And as part of the UN delegation, we were trying to broker peace between the two groups. I remember I used to come back to my hotel room every night in tears because it seemed so hopeless, how both sides hated each other. But as I spent time with them, I began to understand that, because their history was full of the hatred. So as a child, when you're growing up, if all that you're taught is to hate the other, you do end up hating the other. Because the brain is pliable. We can mold it to what we want. And that's really the power of conditioning. My challenge was, can we reprogram those brains? That's what we were there for. It was frustrating, and yet finally we did have some success, because the interesting thing about being in Gaza was, although the Israeli government and the Palestinian semi-government was at loggerheads with each other, they still continued to trade with each other. Business is the best lubricant of society. People were trading with each other. And when we created opportunities for those people to actually trade even better, to get to know each other better, they did it. And they were able to actually overcome that program of revenge and hatred that was there. It was not easy. So to answer your excellent question, sir. Sir, yes. My hearing is not very good, so if you don't mind grabbing a mic, that'll be really useful.
Now 50 years has gone, almost. And now, how do you explain it again now? As you said that they are combining, but still you see a lot of noise from that part of the world.
You see, unfortunately, and this is happening in our part of the world here too, it's part of the government's agenda to actually keep up the hatred sometimes.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Look, I don't want to name any names, but look at what's happening here. It's a powerful agenda. You see, when societies fight with societies, when we hate the other, as we call it in psychology, When we hate the other, we can hide a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't need to be addressed, because that is such a powerful emotion, the whole nation rises. And that's what we're interested in, but we're not interested in the deeper questions. So unfortunately, a lot of the time it comes from strategy and education, the media, right? When you have screaming TV channels, my friends, what do you expect? Sir.
Professor, 5 years back, I attended a class of yours in ISB, Hyderabad, and you still remain the same.
My goodness.
Thank goodness.
Oh my
You
goodness.
just the same, and you make us think the whole night. And again, I think this will be the same night once again. I am a 70s born, and I personally take a pride saying that we have that, survival instinct which made us see through, from an age where there was no telephones, there was no TVs, there was only the transistor, the Murphy transistor, and to what we are today. Do you think this survival instinct can still keep us going for the next, whatever runway we have left?
Yeah.
And also, I start realizing this need hierarchy theory created by this great gentleman. I feel it today, being of that time. Do you think these things are still relevant, or these are all thrown out of the window?
No, I think it's very relevant. And I'm going back to your earlier question. And by the way, delighted to meet you again. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you earlier with the light in my face. That survival instinct that we carry is actually the channel for the next stage that we want to talk about. That upgrading the self-ware actually comes from survival. And not all survival mechanisms are bad. Survival mechanisms are extraordinary. So for example, when you get up in the morning and you love to go to work, as we heard from the professor in the earlier session, that also comes from the survival instinct, right? You get up in the morning and you are charged up, your whole body is charged with adrenaline as a chemical that seeps into your bloodstream. That comes from the survival mindset. So when people become passionate about something, that comes out of survival again. So I'm not trying to say we need to get that survival thing out of the way, not at all. That is your baseline. We build on that. But if you merely do only that, then that becomes a problem. So to me, the survival instinct is a launch pad. It's like something that you can build on and go to something even bigger. So, and regarding your second question, I think it is still valid. Of course it is. No question about it. Thank you. One more, and then I think I've got to let you go. It's 5 past 8.
Sir,
Yeah.
I have one question. You explained all complex things very easily. Thank you very much. But you told we have 3 mindset. Okay, that is AI. We developing AI, and 21st century will lead by AI. Okay, then AI will be mindset 3.
No.
And no, sorry, my question is not completed. That is, my question is, do you think AI will do mindset 3 and human being will do mindset 1? Because biological state, because AI will do all thinking and all things. So what will do by the mankind?
Well, great question. Again, I have to say I don't know. But for me, when I came up with this way of explaining, and by the way, we don't have 3 mindsets. This is just a model I'm using to explain how it works. When I came up with this model, I certainly intended it to be used for the human brain, that we have to learn to operate at mindset 3. But what I'm taking from you, sir, is that if we don't, we run the risk of becoming, that we are operating at that level and everything is being run mindfully by AI. And that is a powerful statement that you have made. And I hope we don't fall into that trap. Thank you very much. Okay, we got one more, and then we'll call it a day. Just one more, please. Grab the mic.
Good evening, sir. In fact, thanks so much for making us aware about all those challenges which we are going through. You presented about 21C mind tools. We understand those 4 tools and I think 5 tools. In fact, everybody practice it also. Can you please put more lights how we can practice it on a daily basis? Because after this session, we might carry it for 2 days, 3 days, and later on it will slip out of our mind.
It's a great question. Yes, and you're right. I think it's so easy to sit here and agree to those tools because we all intellectually have an agreement about those things, right? It's a no-brainer. As we say, it's not rocket science. You understand that. That's what really is something we require. The point is, do we get to practice it? And for me, the best place to practice is home. We talked about fresh eyes, new eyes. If you're married, if you are, okay? And if you've been married for a long time, you're too young to be married for a long time, but if you're married for a long time, the challenge I give to people is when you wake up in the morning, can you look at your spouse with fresh eyes? Okay. And have a new conversation with that person. Give attention to that person. Give attention to that person. And when you do that, you realize that there's a new energy that happens. There's a new conversation. You ask questions. It's not about the same stuff all over again, but you're asking a different question. You're suddenly showing an interest in that person. That's one example. You know, we have to train ourselves. We have to build these muscles again. It is so easy to not do this. And you're so right, it can get swept away. And the next time you come together, we again talk about something like this. We have to practice them. We have to display them at our places of work, with our teams, with the colleagues, but do it at home. You see, when we learn to do this with the people that we most take for granted, which is your family, that's where we start building the muscle. So I take the spirit in what you're saying, absolutely right. There's no point talking about this if I don't make this part of who I am. Thank you so much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.